Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. It's 2023, amazingly enough, and we are on our fifth series of the show. And in 2023 and 2024, we're going to be looking at the last 100 years of American democracy between 1924 and 2024. And what we're doing for this first show in the fifth series is setting the scene of America in 1924. What kind of country was America, and what kind of democracy was it? And who better to do it with than an old friend of the show, Adam Hochschild, a best-selling author of many different books. He was on the show back in series 2 when we were talking about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And since then, he's come out with a new book, American Midnight, a book about American democracy, or perhaps the lack of American democracy between 1917 and 1920. It's a best-selling book, and it's been acclaimed, as most of his books are, by the critics. Adam is joining us from his home in Berkeley. Last time we did the interview, Adam, was in 2022. We sat in your lovely garden. This was in the midst of COVID. Much has happened between 2020 and 2023. But to begin, let's turn the clock back, Adam. Turn the clock back to 1924. What kind of country was America in 1924 to set the scene for our new series? Tell me about America in 24.
Well, I would say it was a post-traumatic country because it had just gone through a very difficult period couple of years earlier, starting in 1917 and lasting through 1921 or so, a period that is largely left out of our high school history textbooks. There's specialized historians who study it, but it's not part of the American history you get in school. Those of us who went to high school in this country, there was a chapter in the textbook on the First World War, where the American doughboys, as they were called, went off to Europe in their broad-brimmed forest ranger hats. They fought bravely, they won the war, they were welcomed home by ticker tape parades. And then you turn the chapter, and the next chapter, it's the 1920s, Prohibition, speakeasies, Babe Ruth, the coming of talkie movies. But in between, there was a very nasty time in this country. It was a time that saw political repression, such as we have really not seen since the end of slavery. During those 4 years, 1917 to 21, roughly 1,000 Americans went to prison for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods, solely because of things they wrote or said. It was also a time when there was vigilante violence on a large scale, sponsored by the Justice Department, and it was a time of press censorship. Some 75 newspapers and magazines were put out of business during this period by the federal government. All these things we tend to have forgotten about, but I think they were a severe trauma. And in 1924, to go back to the beginning of your question, the country was still recovering from that.
I'm intrigued by your phrase post-trauma. What does that mean for a society living after trauma? Was it a conscious trauma? Was there a recognition that the First World War had been, in a sense, a failure? Of course, by 24, Wilson was out of power. He mismanaged the end of the war, and his presidency ended in controversy and in some ways in disgrace. We always associate America with Martin Luther King's notion of an arc, an upward arc, but by 1924, was that arc going backwards, Adam?
Well, it had stabilized by 1924, but certainly during the preceding decade, the arc had really gone downwards. And I think there were really two events that triggered it. One was American entry into the First World War. A country going to war full scale always triggers a lot of madness, almost anywhere where it happens. The second event was later in 1917. The Russian Revolution struck fear into the hearts of big businessmen and establishment political leaders all over the world, certainly in this country, because they were afraid it was going to spread here. And both those two events, I think, kind of set fire to a lot of conflicts which had been simmering under the surface and sometimes not so far under the surface in this country for some years. One was the conflict between nativists and immigrants, something we still have a lot of tension around today. This had been very severe for a long time. There was a lot of hostility to immigration, and going to war with Germany and then the fear of the Russian Revolution, accelerated that. Another conflict was between business and labor. In the decades leading up to 1917, dozens of people were killed in labor violence each year. Just 1913-14 alone, more than 70 people, some of them women and children, were killed by company detectives and federal militia putting down a miners' strike in Colorado. Once the US went to war, that violence against labor could become more severe, because then business could accuse workers of impeding the war effort. Another thing that these tensions accelerated was racial violence. The year 1917 saw more Black Americans die violently than any year since the immediate aftermath of slavery. So these tensions were accelerated by America going to war, by the Russian Revolution, those pressures coming on a country that was filled with tension and unresolved conflicts.
Adam, it always seems to me somewhat odd that America changed so much in the First World War, for better and worse, so much dramatic sociological upheaval on the racial front, on the gender front, on the economic front. And then when Wilson exited the scene, America elected a profoundly backward-looking 19th century figure, Harding. What was going on there? What does Harding's election tell us about the nature of American democracy in the early 20s?
Well, here's how I would interpret it. The second term of Woodrow Wilson from 1917 to 21 was this period that I wrote about in American Midnight that was really filled with hysteria, with rage against immigrants and refugees, with a great deal of labor violence, and with political repression and press censorship. It reached its climax, in a way, in May 1920, where the then Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the leading Democratic candidate for president for the presidential nomination in 1920, predicted repeatedly that May 1st, the International Workers' Holiday, May 1st, 1920, would see a nationwide communist uprising. And people were hysterical about it. They put the National Guard on alert. The cities called in extra policemen. New York City had all three shifts of the police force on duty, one shift on the street, the others waiting in station houses. J.P. Morgan hired extra guards. The day came, nothing happened. And I think that sort of let the air out of the balloon of the Red Scare and hysteria of this period. Palmer did not win the presidential nomination. It sort of let the air out of his campaign. And Harding, the Republican candidate, was elected on the slogan, "Return to normalcy." I think people realized they had been in a state of hysteria and paranoia, and they wanted to go back to something normal.
Adam, most of our listeners and viewers won't be familiar with Palmer, but they will be familiar with the name J. Edgar Hoover, of course, whose career began under Palmer. And of course, he became the wunderkind of the 1920s and built the FBI. To what extent can we see in 1924 the beginnings of what we might think of as a surveillance state, the one that J. Edgar Hoover fantasized about?
I think it had really begun 7 or 8 years earlier. A couple things happened in 1917 when the US entered the First World War formally in April of that year. One was this: there had always been a huge number of private detectives at work in the United States who worked for corporations, snooping on labor unions, infiltrating labor unions, trying to disrupt strikes, sometimes beating up strikers, all that kind of thing. Starting in 1917, a number of these folks went to work for the federal government. Some of them for the Bureau of Investigation, which added federal to its name some years later, but it was essentially the FBI as we know it. Some of them for military intelligence. By the end of 1918, there were 1,000 people in military intelligence in the United States who were doing surveillance of American civilians. All of that stuff got born during this period and has not gone away. This stuff is still with us, the surveillance state. I think there are other things we have to worry about today. Today, I'm a little more worried about the surveillance of us all that goes on by private corporations, but that's a different subject. But yes, the surveillance state really did get born in 1917.
You mentioned your fear of contemporary surveillance, which goes, of course, with the digital revolution and companies like Amazon and Google. Last time you were on the show, you articulated your fear of those. What was the state of media in 24, Adam? American Midnight covers the way in which the American state during the First World War censored much media, particularly media critical of the war, through the post office. Can you give me a general view? How free was American media in 1924?
Well, by that point, the restrictions from the wartime years had eased. One thing you have to say for Harding, who was indeed not one of our greatest presidents, is that the moment he took office in March of 1921, he ended censorship. Censorship had been established by the Espionage Act after the US entered the war in 1917. It was exercised zealously by the Postmaster General, who had the power to determine what traveled through the US mail. And in those days, no internet, no radio, no TV. The mail was everything. Now, daily newspapers could be sold on street corners and delivered to people's homes, but weeklies, monthlies, journals of opinion, the vast majority of the socialist press, the vast majority of the foreign language press, all depended on the US mail. And Woodrow Wilson's Postmaster General was a terrible guy, a man named
you describe him in the book. He's absolutely appalling.
Albert Burleson, former congressman from Texas, arch segregationist, hated the black press. He was the son and grandson of Confederate veterans, and he loved being chief censor and used his power over that second term of Woodrow Wilson's to, in effect, shut down 75 newspapers and magazines by not allowing them through the mail, and banned specific issues of many others as well. He left office with the rest of the Wilson administration in March 1921. Harding came in. Harding had actually been a newspaper publisher before he entered politics. He didn't like censorship, and he ended it. So you have to say that for him. The media in those days was almost entirely print. There began to be some radio in the 1920s. I don't know how much of it there was in 1924, certainly later in the decade. There were newsreels in movie houses. That was another important form of media, but no TV and, of course, no internet.
And one of the most colorful, if not the most colorful figure in American mid-90s, Emma Goldman, and you cover a number of other female activists, particularly pacifists. In that MLK-style arc of justice, was the 6 years between the end of the war in 1924 and an upward journey for female rights, for women's rights to vote, and for women's participation in American democracy?
Yes and no. Certainly the big step forward was when women throughout the country got the vote in 1920. This had been, there'd been agitation for this for years. Women did have the right to vote in some states, but not throughout the country until that was guaranteed by an amendment to the Constitution in 1920. So that was a step forward. Also, during the war, women advanced in other ways because 4 million men had been drafted into the army, and business and industry of all types needed somebody to do the jobs they'd been doing in factories and offices and elsewhere. And many business executives discovered, somewhat to their surprise, that women could often do these jobs better than men. And you can find traces of this in the business literature of the time. This was upsetting to many men who, of course, wanted their jobs back when they returned from the war. And I think the same thing happened after World War II, where when men came home from the war, they went back to work, and the women who had been working then went back to being housewives and so on, but not always happily so. And you can certainly see a lot of traces of this tension between the genders during this period, as I think there always is when something like a war disrupts what people think of as the normal order of things.
The great stain, of course, on American history is race. You've written about it, you've lived it, Adam, in many ways, both within and outside the United States. Can one make some generalizations about the state of race relations in 24? Of course, it came out of the First World War. You already touched on the way in which some African-American groups were persecuted and shut up during the First World War. Are there equivalents between the experience of Black Americans and female Americans in the First World War and its aftermath?
Well, I think for Black Americans also, if we're looking at the year 1924, it was a post-trauma experience. The preceding years had been incredibly difficult. Part of the source of that tension was the Great Migration of Black Americans fleeing the South, going north, east, west, trying to get away from a region where there was often an average of one lynching a week. They came north looking for better jobs. They often found them, but they found, their white neighbors very often didn't want them there, in part because they were willing to work for less money, since they were coming from extremely ill-paid jobs, picking cotton as sharecroppers and doing stuff like that in the South. So there was a lot of tension on that score, which then accelerated when in 1919, those 4 million American men who had been mobilized into the army were all demobilized during that year. And Black and white veterans were competing for jobs, and the jobs weren't there because the factories that had been making, ships and tanks and guns and planes and ammunition for the war were shut down. So 1919 saw a huge amount of racial violence. It's always in the history books as race riots, but it really should be called white riots, because in almost every case it was a matter of a white mob attacking Black people. This happened in major cities throughout the Northeast and the Midwest. It left hundreds of people, almost all of them Black, dead. We still don't know the full death toll because the largest single episode of that violence happened in a place called Elaine, Arkansas, where both federal troops and local vigilantes suppressed a group of black folks who were trying to organize a sharecroppers union. Many of them were killed. Their bodies were simply tossed in the Mississippi River and floated downstream, and we don't know how many died, but the best estimates were that it was hundreds there alone.
What was the, shall we say, the ideological and organizational state of socialism and working class movements in the early 20s, particularly in 24?
I would say the possible forks in the road came earlier and later. By 1924, the Socialist Party was minuscule because it had been crushed so ruthlessly during this repressive period from 1917 to 21. Dozens of socialist leaders, former socialist candidates for office and so on, were jailed, some of them for long periods of time during this era. The party's high point, I think, came just before that happened, which was in 1917, where the Socialist Party did extremely well in municipal elections, winning more than 20% of the vote in 14 of the country's largest cities, more than 30% in several of them, 22% in New York City. This terrified the Wilson administration and led to a lot of repression directed against the party. Could it ever have become a majority party in the United States? I don't think so, because I don't think American socialism, much as we can imagine all kinds of nice things happening under it, I don't think it ever would have attained majority status here, because this country was so much made up of immigrants who came here from Europe wanting to raise their class status. And I think that was the ambition that predominated, rather than wanting to battle as the working class against the capitalists. But I do think that if the party hadn't been so ruthlessly suppressed in this era, and had it lasted as a strong minority voice, it might have pushed the US towards the kind of better social safety net and genuine comprehensive national healthcare system that exists in most Western European countries, that exists across the border in Canada. You know, in much of Europe, these systems were put in place in order to steal a march on the socialists who were, you know, demanding much more comprehensive reforms. But that didn't happen in the United States.
Yeah, when we talked in 2020, Adam, you articulated an envy, if you like, for Northern European systems, particularly Scandinavian social democratic systems. And we noted, again, most people have noted this, the uniqueness of the American experience. Back in 24 and in the early 20s, was the American experience as radically different from Europe as it seems to be now? Was America more like Europe, do you think?
Good question, Andrew. I'm not sure how I would answer that. I think one thing that happily did not exist in the US at that time was there wasn't the kind of fascist movement that there was in Italy in 1924. There wasn't, the incipient Nazi movement that there was in Germany. There were certainly some nasty forces in the US. 1924 actually was the peak year of membership for the Ku Klux Klan. But that never became the sort of majoritarian force in the US that the Nazis and the fascists did in Italy and in Germany. I think the real break and divergence from Europe came later on in the 1930s, when not just Germany and Italy, but all over Eastern Europe, there were semi-fascist regimes, military dictatorships everywhere from Lithuania to Greece to Portugal. And in the United States, I think we were very lucky to have Franklin D. Roosevelt as president, who took the country in a different direction. And, people were willing to support what he was trying to do under the New Deal to put people back to work.
So, Adam, let's conclude. It's always hard as a historian. You're a very, very sophisticated one. When stuff happens, it seems inevitable. When it doesn't, it seems impossible. But of course, that's the wrong way of thinking about history. Imagine we didn't know the future in 1924. I know that's an absurd way of thinking about it because we do. But if we didn't, cast yourself back to 1924, Adam. What was the promise of American democracy? What was the great promise and what was the great fear?
Well, I think the promise of American democracy was that for many, I think of the immigrants arriving from Europe, was the promise that you wouldn't be held back here by your ethnicity, by what language you spoke at home, by the class that you had been born in. This was a country for many people where their hope was to get rich, and their hope was not to experience the discrimination, whether ethnic or religious, that they'd experienced in Europe. Certainly, especially for people like the Jews from Eastern Europe who came here in large numbers. So that was certainly a promise that had driven many people here. But we shouldn't forget, if we're talking about 1924, that year was an important turning point because the immigration law passed that year essentially slammed the door on immigrants for more than 40 years to come. And in American Midnight, I write a lot about the maneuverings leading up to that law. Although the law didn't go into effect until 1924. So in a way, the very thing that many people coming to this country had felt as a great promise in preceding years was foreclosed from 1924 on, at least, to newcomers coming after that point, because there were so few of them.
Sorry to interrupt, Adam, but there's no reason why America could not have maintained its democracy and restricted immigration.
No, I don't think so. I think you're right that it did maintain its democracy, and I think its democracy did make some considerable forward movement in the 1930s under the pressure of the Depression. But I think it's paradoxical that it came just as the door slammed shut. And I'd like to think of democracy as one that where we become a more and more democratic country, but where we don't slam the door on people coming from other parts of the world, especially if they are fleeing war and violence, as so many of them are these days.
Adam, finally, you've taught at UC Berkeley, so you're good at giving grades. Over the 100 years of its history between 1924 and 2024, what grade would you give American democracy?
My inclination, because, it's so easy to be critical of what you see around you, is to give it a C or a C plus. But then when I travel to other countries, I tend to raise America's grade. It depends where I go. But I've lived in recent years for 6 months at a time, one stretch in Russia and one stretch in India. And I came back from both of those places sort of wanting to give American democracy a higher grade. On the other hand, when I travel to the Nordic countries and see some of the remarkable things they've done there, I come back home and want to lower the grade. So it depends who you compare our country to.